Ladies and gentlemen, our special guest today is not only a broadcasting legend, he is a cultural icon for three generations of the citizens of Memphis, Tennessee. He was the co-host of the highest rated local television show in America for 30 years, and he is on the Mount Rushmore of pro wrestling announcers. And as I've said a little bit earlier, my favorite wrestling announcer, the incomparable Lance Russell. Lance, thank you very much for being on the program today.
Holy mackerel, you still got that same line of gab, buddy.
Well, and you know,
Jim, I'm doing great, and what an honor to be on with you. I've had wondering that if I'd heard rumors too about the Jim Cornette podcast, and I was wondering, is he ever going to ask me to come be with him? And now here I am.
Well, I just had to wait until we got the listeners up because I didn't want to, I didn't want to waste you in the early days. We were still building a following, Lance. But I've got, as the scientist said to Michael Rennie in The Day the Earth Stood Still, when he realized he was a man from outer space, I've got several thousand questions to ask you. But I'll try to keep it to the basics and to the stuff that the people really want to know, because you have seen so much wrestling history, and you started out in Memphis. We're going to talk about the early days of Memphis wrestling on television. But Lance, let me ask you this. When did you first see pro wrestling? Were you a fan before you got involved in the business? When and where did you first see pro wrestling?
It was in Dayton, Ohio. I know that comes out of the blue because I haven't had occasion to talk too much about Dayton, Ohio in a long time. But that is where I was went to high school there and grew up there, and I got to the point where I had a job working as an usher at the auditorium in Dayton, and one of the things that they had was wrestling. Like once a month, I think they may have had it, and so I was working, and what the heck, that was a good way to pass the time of day, and that's why I really got hung up on it. And then a little bit later, as I moved on down and I gotten into the broadcasting business and came down and was in Jackson, Tennessee, and worked for a station owned by Aaron Robinson, and he had radio, television, had the local baseball team, etc. And I was walking through the building one day, and he said, "Hey, Lance, did you ever broadcast any wrestling?" I said, "No, I sure haven't, as a matter of fact." But that doesn't stop me from saying that I can do it, because I've been a fan, and I started in Dayton, Ohio. So he said, "Well, you better get your shoes on, because we're going to be starting in 2 weeks' time carrying live wrestling from a theater." They had bought a theater right across the street from the main part of the television station, and we used to have our own matches there with a theater, seats out there, and the whole deal. And so that's where I got started at it, Jimmy, and it's still a big show going on.
Well, let me ask you, in Jackson at that time, and what time period was this? I'm not trying to date you or anything, but this had to be very early in the television years.
Yes. The television started in the Mid-South in 1948, when WMC TV took to the airway on Channel 5, and they carried from a building in downtown. This was not the regular wrestling building, but they carried it. It was at the time, as a matter of fact.
The Ellis Auditorium?
Yes. I do remember one thing, and that was the announcer at the matches was Charlie Sullivan. Charlie was a staff announcer, and he turned out to be the best I've ever seen, and I learned more from Charlie than just about all the other people that I mentored under all of my life. Charlie was great, and I take my hat off to him.
The first wrestling in Memphis, well, like you said, was on WMC, and they broadcast some of the matches from the live event, which was still weekly on Monday nights, even back in those days, and with Charlie Sullivan at ringside, and that was a period where They didn't even have studio wrestling. It hadn't been invented yet.
No.
And
No.
so they aired the matches live there. Did you work any of those, or was it later on when
No.
studio wrestling popped up on Whbq that you got the chance to call wrestling?
At that time, I was still living in Jackson, Tennessee in 1948 when they went. And you're refreshing the mind now. That's exactly what happened, because they never carried the main event on WMC. They always just led up to it. So in order, when they built the main event up and all the promotion that they did on it the week before, and anything that they did with a window cards, which was big back in those days, in the early days of wrestling, and they would build up the main event, and son of a gun, they never seemed to get the main event on television. The time would run out, and I don't know how that happened, but that's the way it went. At that time, I was over in Jackson, and I was doing radio. Of course, no television, because the only thing they had was when we would put the rabbit ears up or put a couple of coat hangers up and brought it in from 80 miles away in Memphis, and that's was my broadcasting work at the time. Then when the television station did come in, that Aaron Robinson started in Jackson, Tennessee, we ultimately added to the roster the Saturday night wrestling, and studio wrestling came to Jackson live and direct, and it was on a Saturday night, and it was the last thing on, and we had no restrictions on time, just whatever we needed to get the match in. And it was pretty interesting the way it all took place, Jimmy.
Well, those days in live television, and it was the infancy, it was the pioneer days of television. And, you know, people have talked about Sid Caesar and Milton Berle and your show of shows and all these great variety shows, but local television, it was all hands on deck. Everybody do every job, and you didn't get a second chance at it because everything was live. There was no videotape, and that had to be a great environment to learn in. So you got some pretty heavy on the job training right off the bat. I
got to tell you, it was the best training that you could possibly have, because you called it exactly right, Jimmy. Everybody did everything. I mean, what are you, an announcer up there? Well, that too. Do a little floor sweeping and a few other things. But it's true, just that we did everything at the station, and it gave us an opportunity. I think of you because I know that impish sense of humor of yours. You would have loved what some of the guys who were wrestling at the time had pop into their heads. I used to do the commercials. We did them live, and it was by and large all ad-lib commercials when people who bought these sponsorship of the wrestling on the air. We just had a general rundown of things on a piece of paper, things that we wanted to say about the company and the product and whatever it was. And we had a semicircle around the ring, Jim. You didn't know you were going to get all this stuff with you.
I love it. I love it.
Well, we had a semicircle around the ring, and in this corner would be a couple of tables stacked up with coffee, and there'd be all these bags of coffee around there and signs up and so on. And then the next to it would be a little ways over would be a stack of tires and some batteries put in there, big car batteries and so on. And that was with a filling station that was one of the sponsors on it, and so on. Around the ring were all of these different products for the commercials. Well, some of the more interesting wrestlers of the day would go out there and jump into those things right in between, in the middle, when the match was going on. They would jump into, say, the tire commercial area, and they'd start picking up those tires, and heaving the tires at the guys in the ring, and they would bounce off the front edge of the ring, off the front edge of the stage that the studio was up on, like you would have a stage for the screen sitting up above you there. Well, take the screen out, put in a wrestling ring, and then in here they'd heave those tires and they'd come bouncing out into the audience.
So it was audience participation.
Oh yeah, that's what everybody's working tonight, guys.
I have to say, if I could throw in real quick, what this reminds me of is actually a book I'm currently reading called Treadmill to Oblivion by a man named Fred Allen, who was on radio in the 30s and was on television in the 50s on shows like What's My Line. The book is about basically what radio was like in the 30s and how they would have to change their show on the fly based on whatever the advertiser wanted, and they'd have to sort of insert advertising in awkward points in the show, and that's kind of what it makes me think of. I'm not sure if you, Mr. Russell, are familiar with Fred Allen, but he was quite the character.
Oh, you just happen to name one of the greats of all time. He and Jack
absolutely.
Benny. He started at the same, and Jack Benny was at the same time, and they used their friendship off the microphone as part of the material and shtick for their work that they did on the air. And,
yes, they did.
And there was all kind of things. There would be a reference to Fred Allen from Jack Benny and vice versa, and it was just, all of it was just super, super fun.
Oh, big time. As a matter of fact,
well, I was just going to say, Allen's Alley, one of the characters that Fred Allen, we're going completely off track of wrestling here now, but one of the characters that Fred Allen invented was Senator Claghorn, that later became the inspiration for Foghorn Leghorn. I say, boy, you're bothering me.
It's true, but they had, I'm sorry.
I'm older than I look.
Never. No one can control Jimmy Cornette.
And Jimmy jumped in there on us.
The one last thing I'll say is yes, but between Jack Benny and Fred Allen, they had, let's say, one of the earliest, not wrestling, but earliest rivalries on radio where they would go after each other, but they were obviously great friends. Anyway, I just wanted to throw that in because that was coming to mind.
Well, no,
thank you for doing that. I'd forgotten about that.
That actually is the early days of television, Lance. You saw so much, and still when what we know it as Memphis wrestling started on WHBQ, and I think it was 1957, it was still live every Saturday morning, and it was as down and dirty and as primitive as you could get because it was still local television. But 57 in Memphis was a period where the promoter had been a guy named Les Wolf, and that's the year that Roy Welch and Nick Goulas, the Nashville office, who had never been aligned until then officially with the city of Memphis, bought the city of Memphis and folded it into their empire of Nashville and Chattanooga and Birmingham. And they kept Les Wolf, I guess, as the booker. That changed over the next year or two. But how important was it to Memphis wrestling? Because before that, after the WMC live matches that you talked about had gone off the air, the primary publicity was newspaper, maybe radio, word of mouth, but now television on a regular basis to promote those Ellis Auditorium events had come to Memphis, and that had to be what brought Memphis into being one of the big drawn cities in the country.
It certainly was the most what was exactly behind the growth that took place in there. And then you had some interesting changes. Buddy Fuller took over the booking of the area, and as a matter of fact, I don't how all that went with the families as to how much was still, whether Buddy, I got the impression through the whole thing that Buddy was the man when it came to it, as long as Buddy stayed in there. And
Buddy was Roy Welch's son, just so everybody is familiar.
That's right. And he and his brothers, Herb Welch, wrestled there. Lester Welch also wrestled, but Buddy was the one that called it, and he came in the middle of what was the biggest drawing attraction that ever came to Memphis in terms of a regular feud, and that was Sputnik Monroe and Billy Wicks, Billy Wicks, who was a deputy on the sheriff's department there, and was an excellent wrestler, very good amateur wrestler. And they were the ones that went into the baseball park downtown and packed that thing full with 6,300 people or something like that.
Well, as a matter of fact, thanks to our friend, you know him too, Mark James, who does the Memphis Wrestling History website, Sputnik Monroe, and we have talked about Sputnik Monroe here a bunch of times on our program and the impact that he had in Memphis wrestling. They had such a hot program, Sputnik Monroe and Billy Wicks. They were main eventing all the summer of 1959. And they went down to Russwood Park on August 3rd and drew over 10,000 people, and then came back the next week where they had a regular match at the auditorium, but they weren't wrestling each other. They were both on the card. And then they came to Russwood Park on August 17th with the former boxing champion Rocky Marciano as the referee, and that's where they drew 13,749 people, and that was the paying customers, because the newspaper accounts say that about 3,000 or 4,000 people broke down the outfield fence and got in to see the thing. And that still stands as the most people ever to see a wrestling match in the city of Memphis. And I know Billy Wicks was a heck of a baby face, and people were still telling stories about him when I got into business in the early 80s, but Sputnik Monroe was the character, right? What was your interaction with Sputnik Monroe?
No question about it. Sputnik was the very thing that was one of the main taproot of all of Memphis wrestling. They say, what's different about Memphis wrestling? What's all this conversation about Memphis wrestling? Well, you can, just as you put it, you can nail it right on the back of Mr. Monroe, because he brought in enough energy, and the way he lived it right through his entire life. He would be down, and of course here he was integrating outside of the ring. He would be down on Beale Street, going into the bars and sharing a beer with some of the guys, and the whole thing. And it was just, he lived the entire role that he'd had in the ring. And that's why some guys resent the fact of having to do that. But there was one guy who really lived it, and the promoters had to be awfully glad that he did, because he did, Jimmy. You accurately called it. He was part of that entire thing that made Memphis wrestling. He wasn't the only one. Obviously, we could name people like Jimmy Cornette and Jerry Lawler, a bunch of others. But
you know, when you do a list of the most important people in Memphis wrestling history, in the ring it was Sputnik Monroe, Jerry Lawler, Jackie Fargo. As promoters, it was obviously Roy Welch and Jerry Jarrett. As announcer, it was Lance Russell. I think you might throw Bill Dundee in that mix, and then it pretty much drops off from there as far as impact on Memphis wrestling. But Sputnik was the first one in the ring to really capture the people's imagination, and it was the time of Elvis, and rock and roll was getting started, and he was a colorful guy. What was it like to interview Sputnik Monroe on live television? Did you ever know what you were going to get out of it?
You knew this. It was going to be a trip, because he had something to say that some of it you were embarrassed about, and some of it you were awfully glad he had said. He was a very colorful guy. He just had that mind that went 100 miles an hour, and he was able to spin it off and say things that people would be a little offended by. Some of the people would be, but he really brought out the interest in wrestling, because, as I said, he incorporated. It wasn't just a question of an hour and a half or 2 hours down at the auditorium, and that was Memphis wrestling. For Sputnik Monroe, it was 24 hours a day, and every single day. And he's the one I think they give a lot of credit, and a lot of it is well deserved in cutting down some of the color line that took place. Now, down at the auditorium, he was right in the middle of all of that, because they had it so separated that, well, you guys have covered that pretty well in your books and things about how he was able to force them to say, let's take away this color line in the seating because we got seats that are going empty here, and yet we're not full with the seats that are here. That is
in the crow's nest, in the black section,
yes,
is what
exactly.
they called the crow's nest back then, and you know, and the suspicion is that, and we're going to talk about this gentleman, Roy Welch was the promoter, and there's a lot of suspicion that he wanted the heel to take the heat just in case it backfired, but it worked, and they ended up doing sellout business, and that launched Memphis wrestling for the next 30 years as being a major draw in city. But of all the people that we just named, Jackie Fargo, Jerry Lawler, Jerry Jarrett, Sputnik Monroe, yourself, nobody ever talks about Roy Welch. And Roy was the promoter that brought Memphis into this era, the guy that made Jerry Jarrett Booker in the late 60s, who took it into a new era.
Right.
One of the most, the senior member of one of the most famous families in wrestling all through the South at one time or another, a member of the Welch, Golden, or Fuller family, was involved in the promotion or a top star in every wrestling promotion south of Indiana. And Roy was the original one. He and his brothers Herb and Lester were tag team and single attractions all over the South. Nobody talks about Roy Welch. Roy had he was the guy that really manipulated Memphis. The saying goes, he never let the Greek, he never let Nick Goulas come over to Memphis. It was his town and his baby. How important was Roy Welch, and what kind of control, I guess, how authoritative was he when he came to the matches on Monday nights? He was calling the shots, but what kind of guy was he?
Roy was the kind of guy that he really would, when he started to say something and found some people not listening, he'd get their attention real quick, and he would. I'll tell you a story in a minute that Miss Audrey, my beloved sweetie, a story that happened with Roy in just a little bit. But I'll tell you, Roy was the kind of guy, I did not ask him, how did you and Nick get together? I heard that he's the one that brought Nick and put him into wrestling down in Birmingham, and that's where Nick got started, and that's it. Roy did not like all of the heat on him, so he would put it off on anybody. He could rig the story to fit, and that's how Roy looked at it.
And Nick Goulas didn't need any help to get heat on himself, from what I understand, either. He did a pretty good job on his own.
Yeah, he did. He was the ideal thing, and that shows you what kind of a eye Roy had. He recognized that feature, I think, with Nick down in Birmingham when Nick was working as a jewelry salesman or something like that. And he said, that's the guy that I want in there taking the heat for me. And that's who he got. He got somebody. And nobody loved the role any more than Nick did. I mean, Nick, he relished that role of being the big bad guy, and you guys better pay attention to it. I think you and I were talking about the unfortunate accident with Sam and the boys when they had the automobile accident, and pardon me, got killed in up near Nashville, and they had the funeral there, and I'll never forget that. I walked up there, and Nick said, "Hey Lance, come on, sit with me. Come on up here." We were going to where the funeral was being held, and one of the guys, I don't remember right offhand, I could have picked anybody's name, any heel's name but I don't remember specifically which one it was. And he started walking in there with us, and boy, Nick got all over him and said, "What are you doing walking here with us? Get out of here. Don't you even come in here." I mean, here a guy coming in for the funeral, and Nick is sitting there and saying, "I don't want you even in the building. You're not supposed to be staying in here with us. Get out of here."
Well, Christine Jarrett used to tell me that Nick would stand outside the box office in Nashville at the Hippodrome and cuss the fans. "Hurry up, get inside, damn it, get inside. Come on, we ain't got all night." But hey, tell a story about Roy Welch and Audrey.
Oh yeah, well, Roy, he had that impish sense of humor, and I'd gotten Miss Audrey a Buick sports car to drive around, and she really loved that thing. It was brand spanking new. And I'd gotten a ride downtown to the Coliseum, to the auditorium, and she came by the auditorium later. We had agreed to meet outside along about 6 o'clock, something like that. Well, Roy and I were standing out underneath what they call the porte-cochere back in the good old days, and up comes Audrey in that automobile. Well, Roy walked with an aluminum crutch that he used as a little help in more ways than one, as I'll illustrate to you. And she drove up there and said, "Man, look at that good-looking car." I'd been talking to him about getting the new automobile. And he walks up beside that car, standing on the sidewalk as she pulled right up to the edge of it. And Roy took that aluminum crutch and he reached up in the air with that thing. It looked like he was going for a 4-bagger in baseball. He took a swing at the top of her car. And the next thing I know, here comes my dainty little sweetheart wife flying out of that car. I thought it was going to be a one fall, no question about who wins that match, when she came flying out of that car saying, "Get away from me, Roy. Why don't you stop hitting on my automobile?" I said, "Oh, my Lord, I'm going to have to live with that now, Roy, for the next week or two, hearing about what you did to her car and all." So he thought that was the funniest thing that he could have done.
Well, he's been overlooked in wrestling history because Roy Welch, like I said, was one of the most important names, not only in Memphis wrestling, but in wrestling all over the South. And you don't hear enough about him anymore. And let me ask you this: in the early days of the TV show, in the 50s and early 60s, who laid out obviously booking was a little bit different in those days than it is today, where everything is scripted and choreographed and et cetera. But who laid out the television show when the guys got there for the wrestlers, and the formats were primitive? They were primitive in the 80s when I started. You basically called it like you saw it, but what was your impressions of the way the show was put together in the locker room?
Well, a lot of it, of course, I didn't know, because this was all kayfabe thing, and no announcers don't even need to know hardly what the guy's name is. And as a matter of fact, don't tell him what his name is. Let him make up a name. And anyhow, but what I was going to say is that particularly when you go back into the Jackson, Tennessee era, where I first jumped on board with the wrestling, there was absolutely no communication whatsoever about anything that was going to happen. The only thing that if you wanted to know something about a hold, you could either ask the wrestler, you could ask ask Roy Welch if he was around, or whoever, but there was never much information available. And just from the sideline of it, seeing it, the best thing I can tell you is I had the impression that the entire card had been laid out somewhere else with somebody else, and somebody like Philip Golden or somebody like that had brought down from somewhere near the Dyersburg territory, and that's where the Welches lived, and so I didn't really have any kind of insight to how that card was made up, Jimmy. And
then when was it that they actually officially smartened you up, so to say? When did they let you in? Because it was so kayfabe in those days. When did they finally say, "Okay, Lance has been here for 10 years now," or whatever? We might as well tell him what's going on.
Well, yeah, and let me tell you, you're just about right when you talk about 10 years, because Roy didn't want to, at any time, he never did, couldn't go with me knowing anything or not. And every now and then somebody'd have to explain, well, it's Roy's the way Roy is. To this date, if Roy was still around, he would have had it kayfabe all the way. That's all it was to it. But
well, as a matter of fact, Jerry Jarrett told a story one time when he was just he might have been a teenager at that point, and he was some spot shows and working part time, whatever. Roy at that. What'd you think about the match last week? Or what'd you think about the match, blah, blah, blah. And Jerry would come in one time and he said, the main event was real exciting, Mr. Welch. That was with the Fargo brothers. But the opening match, I actually think that they were in collusion with each other and they were faking it. And Roy put these things in the back of his mind and said, maybe this kid will catch on. Speaking of the Fargos, Jackie and Don Fargo came in the late 50s, and they were the most revolutionary tag team that Tennessee territory had seen. They'd sold out in Madison Square Garden, or were about to. Jack Pfeffer was their manager a lot of time, booked them in a lot of places. But Don never stayed anywhere too long. But Jackie stayed in Tennessee, and talk about first as a heel and later as a babyface. Jackie Fargo was more or less like Tennessee's version of Nature Boy Buddy Rogers, who he had worked on a lot of shows with and probably emulated in a lot of ways. But the connection that Jackie Fargo had with the fans is something that you don't find anymore in the modern era. They genuinely believed that he was the baddest man on the planet, whether he was a heel or a babyface, and they either hated him with a passion or loved him with a passion.
Yep, that's absolutely true. You got it. The thing that was amazing, and I've had people ask me about Jackie and this and that, and the one thing that I have consistently said about Jackie is I think Jackie understood the fans better than almost any wrestler that I know of, including Jerry Lawler, who's pretty good at it himself. But Jackie just had that ability. He knew how to put them. Andy Kaufman would have loved that, because he loved the control that particularly the heel wrestlers had over the audience, and not even all of the ones, they didn't have to be present there. They could be watching it on television, and he knew in their home, because he was one of them, that they were reacting just exactly the way they had wanted them to. And that's the way Jackie was. He, all the time that I knew him, he knew when to bring him up. It was kind of like Jerry Lawler reaching for that strap and popping it down. And Jackie Fargo knew when to take him up, when to take him down. And he just was an absolute magician when it came to directing what was happening inside the Coliseum with the wrestling fans. And there's not that many guys. There's a lot of guys that understood it and have done a very, very good job. But I'm talking about to the nth. There was nobody who was any better than Jackie Fargo was at understanding the people that were wrestling fans.
Jackie Fargo gets a lot of credit, and Jerry Lawler gives him a lot of credit. Jackie Fargo gets a lot of credit for being the guy that made Jerry Lawler in Memphis, and he did in the ring. But maybe as many people don't know that there was a guy that got Jerry Lawler and kind of in that position in the first place, and that's a guy named Lance Russell. Because, well, you got some fan mail from a kid going to, I believe, Treadmill High School in Memphis in the late 60s that had some artwork in it, and at the time you were not able, because of technical limitations, you weren't able to show matches from the Ellis Auditorium on Monday nights. So this kid sent some artwork in, and you decided to have him show that to illustrate the matches. Tell a story of how you actually gave Jerry Lawler his first television exposure.
Okay, well, let me clarify one thing. We'll break the kayfabe. It wasn't because of the technical difficulty. It was because the station wouldn't put the lousy money up to have a photographer come down and take pictures of any of this stuff. So, and the wrestling promoters certainly weren't going to foot the bill, so that there was no way you could get anybody down there to do something about bringing back information. They waited for that moment on Saturday when Dave and I would come out and start reviewing what had happened last Monday night at the auditorium, and we'd get to it and we'd talk about it and make it as as exciting as we could, which wasn't really very brilliant, but it still had to do. And then this kid sent his stuff in, and he had these little cartoon characters that you could identify him if you were any kind of wrestling fan. You knew Tojo Yamamoto, Jackie Fargo, Jerry Lawler. You knew the guy and other names which preceded them. You knew who it was because he had that ability that most cartoonists do, that they could put down a few lines and they can make it look like you or whoever. That's what he had done. He had taken the end of the match and whatever was involved, whether it was a chokehold that they were using or regardless of what they were doing, he drew this. And at that time, Jerry Lawler was no more than 15 and could have been as low as 14 when we got these first bit of cartoons.
Caricatures is what
caricatures
There's where we're going.
Demonstrated what happened. And so we followed along with that, and I called the house one time and got Jerry's father on the phone and said, man, people have just been crazy about this, and we'd like to continue to do that if you're going to take him down. Oh, yeah. And I'd like to get him up here. And then Jerry goes through the story of how his dad bought him a brand new suit and all of that to come down to the television station. And he came down, and as usual, we knew it at the time, should have known it at the time. He just took it over. And
so he was a great promo even when he was a teenager coming on as a cartoonist.
That's right. You knew he had something special going. And he did, and it was the drawing. And I told a few people, I don't know whether I told you or not, Jimmy, but it wasn't long ago I was up in the attic when cleaning out stuff, and I ran across the original batch of cartoons and caricatures that Jerry sent in to me, and I still have those things up in the attic.
That led to Lawler actually, obviously, being around the wrestlers enough and around the business enough that he got a job as a kid helping with Fargo. Of course, had his finger in a number of businesses in Memphis. He was in with Eddie Bond, the country music star and radio station owner there. So Fargo was involved in that and a nightclub. And he also had a sign painting business. And Jerry Lawler's first job in wrestling was as an assistant sign painter in Jackie Fargo's sign painting business.
That's exactly right. That's just how that art came. No, wait like cue.
Wait for the cue. The dog got right in.
I couldn't get him. I thought I'd told him that, but they thought I was scratching my ear. I wasn't giving them the cue to. Okay, boys, hush. Okay.
Oh, that's great. As a matter of fact, we're leaving that in. And here's another thing. That I loved about Memphis wrestling. It was live as it happened. If somebody was late, somebody had to fill time. We've seen guys run in, they were still tying their boots. Things happen. And in some cases, I mean, you would go until Guy Coffey, bless him. Guy Coffey was manager of the Ellis Auditorium and they built the Mid-South Coliseum practically around Mr. Coffey. And his wife, Bonnie, sold merchandise for so many years. But Mr. Coffey would come out when it was time for the guys to go home. There was no communication like IFBs with the referees or anything. It's just he'd come out and wiggle his tie. And the guys knew when to go home. And finally, the people got smart to it and said, oh, Mr. Coffey, go on back and let him wrestle. There was a story. We're jumping ahead, but if you can tell the story of, remember when you and Jerry Lawler cut an interview that I don't know if it went 20 minutes or whatever. Wasn't there a bomb threat called into the studio in Memphis?
Boy,
and they had to clear it out.
That was no plan. Let me tell you, that was no plan. That was an absolute legit bomb threat that was called into Whbq while we were on the air. Get the word live, which means that we didn't have the ability to come back and make any kind of changes or to do anything else with it. So we were on live when they called in. Well, as the only executive, so to speak, because that was my job as director of programming, and I mean, all of the whole thing, the running of the things that happened there in the station. I had to make a call on this thing. What are we going to do with this? Do we sit here and take it? Supposing they're telling the truth and there's a bomb, and not only gets all of these people, it'll get me too. And that's not good. But we were faced with a proposition of what are we going to do? Let's find a tape or something we can use. Believe me, that was the last time that we were ever sitting in a position where we didn't have a tape ready on the machine as a standby for in case something like that happened. We had the other one where the middle of the ring, Jimmy, I don't know whether you remember that or not, but
the middle of the ring caved in, one time, didn't it?
Caved in. It just looked like a swimming pool in there. The guys would come off the edge of it, and they could, bless everybody's heart, they kept wrestling, and they'd disappear down in the hole in the middle of the ring, and we were killing time all that time. That was another time where
when they called that bomb threat in, you and Lawler were the only ones that stayed in the studio, right? They cleared the people out and had the bomb squad in, but you guys talked for 20 minutes and nobody at home knew anything was wrong.
That's exactly what we did not want them to know. We did that. We could not let them see that we hadn't, that we were clearing the studio out. Because if they did, they say, "Oh, this is fun. What do you got to do today?" Well, I don't know. Let's go run all the crowd out of the wrestling match down there.
So the copycats.
Yeah, exactly. And so we killed time talking and so forth. Dave Brown was the biggest part of it, and Dave and Jerry and I, and we talked about wrestling and so on and killed the time, and we got through it, and nobody ever knew it, and we never had any more problems with that after that. But that was a terrifying thing at the time. And when you look back on it, even to this day, I can look back and think, boy, was that stupid to make that decision? But I knew that if we ever gave in to it and cleared that out to where the public knew that they could interrupt the program on that we'd never hear the end of it. So
also, like you said, you were not only were you the host of the wrestling show and the voice of the matches on Monday night, but you were the program director at WHBQ Channel 13, which I think was the ABC affiliate at that time in Memphis, was it not? Yeah. And that's why, and you and Davey, and we got to talk about Davey coming up. We got to talk about a lot of things coming up. But while we're on unplanned instances, Mario Galento.
Oh, wow.
Mario Galento actually hit the ring. He was a crusty old wrestler who was probably a few sandwiches shy of a picnic, and hit the ring one time on Jerry Jarrett. And they told his story in the movie Memphis Heat, which was a great piece of work. But from your perspective, when Mario Galento, who wasn't working for the promotion at that time, but had been a big name in Memphis wrestling years before, the reason why he did this was because he wasn't being booked, hit the ring and tried to attack Jerry Jarrett. And I believe it was Jerry Lawler and maybe Jim White and Sam Bass had to help. They were having a match against each other, and the heels had to jump in. It didn't look like anything other than your classic Memphis, angle, a big brawl, a bunch of people beating each other up, except for the circumstances. But what did you think when on live television, this giant real fight breaks out amongst the biggest stars in the company and one of the toughest guys in the business?
I'm telling you the truth. It would just absolutely stunned me. What in the Sam hell are they doing now? And I looked at the way they were going at it in there. Jerry Jarrett jumped out of the ring and ran back into the dressing room. Now, I didn't go to the dressing room with him, but I know that he came back out of there and he had like a billy club or like blackjack, something like that, in his hand, and he jumped back up and he smashed Mario with that and knocked him around and sent him to the hospital, as a matter of fact, using that aid. And the referee was trying to tell him it was illegal all the time. No, he didn't. I was kidding.
Well, I'm going to disqualify you.
Yeah.
You know,
but Mario was a acquaintance. I don't know how close a friend, but he was an acquaintance of Buddy Fuller, and so there was a lot of conversation that maybe Buddy had participated in that thing with Mario, and it was that involved not only the public, but probably even more so the people involved in the wrestling business, Jarrett and all of the other guys.
Well, and then Lawler told a story about when Galento, after that incident, came to Jonesboro, tried to get even with him, and came to ringside with a straight razor and was going after Lawler. And that's when Fargo called Galento up and threatened to kill him if he didn't lay off his boy, and that ended up in court. So at least people wonder why people bought Memphis wrestling in those days, is because they generally thought these crazy people are trying to kill each other.
Hey, that sounds like a great idea. How we do it next week, though?
Yeah. What do you follow that with? I tell you what, we haven't even got started yet, really, because we got to talk about Dave Brown. We got to talk about Jerry Jarrett some more. We've got to talk about the modern
You're pulling
days
the string on me now. No.
Well, no, we got to talk about your days in the NWA. I'm going to do the old thing. I'm going to say we're running out of time on the program, but we're going to keep the tape rolling. And we're going to keep talking, and we're going to bring part 2 of Lance Russell to next week on the Jim Cornette Experience, where we're going to talk about all those things, your days in the NWA, you calling matches that weren't actually happening while they were supposedly happening, and all kinds of stuff. That's enough of a tease. Tune in next week, folks, to the Experience for more of Lance Russell right here.